The man who walked into Rosa Beckett's portrait studio on that blistering Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1882 was wearing Sheriff Alfred Redmond's badge, Sheriff Alfred Redmond's hat, and Sheriff Alfred Redmond's boots. He had Alfred Redmond's square jaw, Alfred Redmond's dark copper-brown hair, and Alfred Redmond's broad shoulders that nearly filled a doorframe. He even carried himself with the same slow, deliberate authority that Rosa had spent the last 6 weeks painting into every stroke of the commissioned portrait that now stood half-finished on her easel. But Rosa Beckett knew, with cold and absolute certainty, that the man standing in her doorway was not Alfred Redmond. She did not move. She did not flinch. She held her finest sable brush suspended over her palette, and she looked at the man with the calm, penetrating focus that had made her one of the most sought-after portrait artists from Santa Fe to Tucson. She looked the way she always looked when she was studying a subject, cataloging every detail, every shadow, every line. And what she saw sent a slow, terrible chill crawling up through her chest despite the brutal July heat. The man smiled at her. Alfred Redmond's smile, almost, but the left corner went 2 degrees higher than it should. The scar above the right eyebrow, a pale crescent that Alfred had earned falling from a horse at 16, sat a fraction too close to the hairline. The hands, when he reached up to tip the hat in greeting, were smoother. A sheriff's hands showed the wear of leather reins and iron handcuffs, and years of rougher living than those hands had ever known. She had spent 43 days painting Alfred Redmond. 43 days of watching him sit across from her, of studying the precise geometry of his face in different light, of understanding the particular weight that duty and loneliness had carved into the lines around his eyes. She knew his face better than she knew her own. She knew it the way a musician knows a melody, the way a surgeon knows a wound. And this was not his face. The trap was elegant, she realized with a terrible clarity. Whoever had sent this double here had done so deliberately. They had dressed him perfectly, coached him in Alfred's manner, sent him to the one place where they could use Rosa to confirm an alibi, to establish that the real sheriff was here in Callaway Creek, while the actual Alfred Redmond was somewhere else entirely, doing something, or having something done to him, that made it necessary for no one to know where he truly was. "Miss Beckett," the man said, in a voice that was just barely close enough but not quite right, just slightly too smooth in its edges. "Thought I'd come see how the portrait was coming along." Rosa put down her brush with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who felt no fear whatsoever, though her pulse was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "I was wondering when you would stop by," she said, and smiled back at him like she believed every inch of the lie. 6 weeks earlier, Rosa Beckett had arrived in Callaway Creek, New Mexico territory, in the back of a supply wagon with 17 pieces of luggage, 14 of which were cases for her paints, canvases, brushes, and the particular kind of rabbitskin glue she used to prime her surfaces. She had come at the invitation of the town council, who had decided with great civic ambition that the new courthouse deserved a commemorative portrait of the sheriff, who had brought law to what had once been the most lawless stretch of the Pecos River Basin. They had offered her $35 and free accommodations above the mercantile, which was 3 times what she usually received, and 5 times more comfortable than the tent she had been sleeping in while completing a commission near the Apache Reservation outside of Albuquerque. Rosa was 28 years old. She had been painting since she was 9, when her father, a traveling daguerreotypist with more ambition than luck, had discovered that his daughter possessed an unsettling ability to reproduce a human face in charcoal with near-photographic accuracy. He had trained her not gently, but he had trained her well, and by the time she was 22 she had developed her own method of oil portraiture that blended the meticulous realism of the European academic tradition with a particular understanding of how harsh frontier sunlight carved the faces of people who lived hard lives outdoors. She had painted cavalry officers and cattle barons, Apache elders and Mexican ranchers, widows and schoolteachers and gamblers. She had traveled alone through territories where traveling alone as a woman was considered either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily stupid, and she had come to the conclusion that those two things were quite often the same. She did not take the Callaway Creek commission for the money, though $35 was genuinely useful. She took it because she had heard about Sheriff Alfred Redmond from 3 separate people in 3 separate towns, and her instinct, which she trusted utterly, told her that his face would be interesting to paint. The first time she met him, she nearly revised that opinion. He was standing outside the jail when she arrived, in the process of having a very loud argument with a cattle rancher named Dobbs, who believed that the laws against grazing his livestock on the common land near the creek did not apply to him personally. Alfred Redmond was not shouting. He never shouted. She would learn. He was simply standing in a way that made it clear that the rancher's continued good health was contingent on the rancher making a different set of choices, and the rancher, despite being a large man with 2 large ranch hands flanking him, appeared to be receiving this message quite clearly. Rosa stood beside her wagon and watched, her arms crossed, her head tilted at the angle she used when she was evaluating a subject's dominant expression. Alfred's jaw was set, his eyes were steady, and there was something in the absolute stillness of him that told her he was a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing in any room was the one that did not move. The rancher left. Alfred turned. He saw her. "You must be the artist," he said. "And you must be the man I am to spend the next several weeks staring at," she replied. He blinked. For one excellent fraction of a second, she caught a flash of something in his expression that looked very much like startled amusement before he locked it back down behind that square, professional face. "Alfred Redmond," he said, and held out his hand. "Rosa Beckett," she said, and shook it like a person who expected to be shaken back with equal firmness, which he did, after a brief moment of recalibration. He was, she decided, going to be very interesting to paint. The portrait sessions began 3 days later, after Rosa had set up her studio in the large front room of her accommodations, arranged the north-facing window light to her satisfaction, and prepared 6 separate canvas grounds while she was thinking about composition. She had Alfred sit in a plain wooden chair facing 3/4 to the window, which was how she preferred to capture faces that were carrying secrets, because the way shadow fell across the side planes of a face revealed far more than full frontal light ever could. He was, to his credit, a patient subject. Many men were not. Many men, especially powerful men, found it intolerable to simply sit and be looked at with that level of concentrated attention, and they fidgeted and talked and attempted to fill the silence with their own importance. Alfred Redmond sat and was quiet, and occasionally watched her work with an expression of genuine curiosity that he seemed not entirely aware he was allowing her to see. On the 3rd session, he asked, "What exactly are you looking for when you look like that?" She was mixing a very specific shade of warm sienna that would form the foundation layer of his skin tone, and she did not look up. "I'm looking for the thing you don't know your face is doing." A pause. "That sounds like an invasion of privacy." "All good portraiture is." She glanced up then briefly to catch his reaction. "You hired a painter, Sheriff, not a photographer. A photographer takes what's there. I paint what's true." He was quiet for a moment, then, "And what's true is different from what's there." "Almost always," she said. Another silence, but this one was different in quality, thoughtful rather than resistant. She had started to understand by this point that Alfred Redmond was a man who considered words before he used them, who measured them out like something valuable, and who therefore paid close attention when someone else used them with similar care. "I've heard of you," he said finally. "From Captain Vargas down at the garrison. He said you painted his portrait and it made his wife cry." "She said it looked exactly like him," Rosa confirmed. "He said that was the problem." He said she had never seen him look that sad. Rosa kept her eyes on the canvas. "He was sad. His eyes told me so, "Painters do not invent things, Sheriff, we only find them." She heard, rather than saw, the slight shift of his posture. She had found something. She filed it away. As the weeks passed, she learned him by degrees. Not through conversation, though they talked more than she expected, but through the accumulated evidence of his face. The way a reader learns a book not just through its words, but through its every page. She learned that the scar above his right eyebrow sat at a very precise angle, the result of a specific fall from a specific horse at a specific moment in his personal history. She learned that the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he was thinking about something that troubled him, and softened when something genuinely amused him. She learned that his left hand rested differently than his right, that he carried old tension in the right shoulder, and that the particular quality of stillness he projected was not natural ease but the result of years of deliberate practice, the stillness of a man who had learned to make himself a fixed point in an environment of chaos. She did not learn these things the way a woman learns about a man she is interested in. She learned them the way she learned everything, systematically, carefully, and with the specific kind of attachment that comes from sustained, deep, observational attention. The fact that this was the most engaging face she had painted in years was a professional assessment. The fact that she found herself thinking about the exact shade of gray in his eyes during the hours she was not painting was something she was not yet ready to assess at all. Alfred, for his part, began to show up for his portrait sessions with slightly more punctuality than was strictly necessary. He began to arrive with coffee from the hotel restaurant, 2 cups, without being asked. He began to say more during the silences, small things, observations about the town, brief fragments of dry humor that he delivered with such studied neutrality that they were twice as funny. He began to look at her work with the focused, genuine interest of a person who is encountering something they had not previously known how to appreciate, and is discovering that they like it very much indeed. One evening in the 5th week, when the light was going golden and she was working on the particular quality of shadow beneath his cheekbone, he said, without preamble, "You live alone, travel alone. You don't seem to find that difficult." It was phrased as an observation but was quite clearly a question, and she appreciated the honesty of the disguise. "I find many things difficult," she said. "Living alone is not one of them. I have very good company." "Your own. Is there better?" She glanced at him. "I mean that genuinely, not as arrogance. I have a skill that occupies my entire mind and a curiosity that occupies the rest of it. I am rarely bored." People who are not bored do not require distraction from their solitude. He looked at her for a moment with the scar over his right eyebrow slightly elevated. "Most women I have met in the territories would have a different answer to that. Most people of any description have a different answer. That is not evidence that the answer is correct." She returned to her canvas. "What about you? You have a badge and a reputation and a town that depends on you. Does that feel like company?" The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "It feels like purpose. That is not the same thing." She looked at him then, really looked, and caught the thing his face was doing without knowing it, the particular quality of loneliness that sat in a person who has chosen duty over intimacy for so long that they can no longer quite remember that there was ever a choice involved. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." She turned back to her canvas, and she added 2 brushstrokes to the shadow behind his right eye, and the portrait became, in that moment, the most honest thing she had painted in years. What happened in the weeks leading up to the day the impostor walked into her studio was not something Rosa had been meant to know about. But Rosa had the particular skill of artists and careful observers, which is to notice the things happening in the background of any scene, while everyone else is focused on the foreground. She noticed that 3 strangers had arrived in Callaway Creek in the week before the impostor appeared. Not together, which was the deliberate part, but she had seen them all in the same 24-hour period, each making separate inquiries around town, each attempting to be unremarkable, and each failing in the particular way that men who are trying to be unremarkable always fail, which is that they try too hard. She had sketched all three of them, as she habitually sketched interesting faces, in the small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket at all times. She had also noticed that Alfred's mood in their last two sessions had shifted in a way that was subtle enough that someone who didn't study his face for a living would have missed it entirely. Something was worrying him. Not the ordinary concern of a lawman in a frontier town that was always present and had a particular texture she had come to recognize. This was something sharper, something he was carrying carefully and alone. She had wanted to ask. She had not asked, because she recognized that the intimacy of the portrait sessions created a particular kind of false closeness, and she did not want to mistake professional proximity for permission to intrude on a man's private concerns. She wished now that she had asked. The double stood in her studio and smiled Alfred's almost smile, and Rosa offered him coffee and conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades learning to show exactly what she chose to show and nothing else. She talked about the portrait. She showed him the progress. She watched his eyes move over the canvas with what was meant to look like interest, but was actually the wariness of a man looking at something he had been told to look at in order to confirm that it fit the description he had been given. He was studying Alfred's image to make sure his own performance was accurate, which told her that he had not been given enough time with the actual man, had probably seen him only briefly and at a distance, and was relying on secondary descriptions for the finer details. She filed every observation carefully and kept her face pleasant and her voice calm, and when he eventually made his excuses and left, walking Alfred's walk through her doorway and out into the summer glare of Main Street, she waited exactly 30 seconds, then crossed to her window and watched him go. He walked toward the sheriff's office, of course. That would be where he needed to be seen, where he needed to establish the fiction that Alfred Redmond was in Callaway Creek today, present and accounted for, while the actual Alfred was, somewhere else, in some kind of danger that Rosa did not yet have enough information to specify, but that every instinct she possessed was screaming about with increasing urgency. She went back to her easel and picked up the right brush and mixed the right color, and then she stopped, put everything down and made a decision. She was not going to wait for this to resolve itself. She was a woman who solved problems through patient observation and then decisive action, and she had observed enough. She needed to find Alfred Redmond. The first thing she did was go to the livery. Not to rent a horse, not yet, but to talk to Joe Halloran, who ran the livery, and who was the kind of man who noticed everything because he was quiet and large, and people tended to underestimate quiet, large men. She had painted Joe's daughter's portrait as a gift for the family 3 weeks earlier, and Joe had looked at it the way people looked at things that confirmed something they had been unsure of, as though someone had finally seen what he had always known was true of his child. And after that, he had been disposed to like Rosa very much. 3 men arrived last week, she said to Joe without preamble, coming to stand beside him while he worked a piece of harness leather. One with a roan mare, one with a gray, one on foot. Have you seen them since? Joe kept working the leather. Roan mare is stabled here. Man picked her up this morning, before dawn. Before dawn, Rosa repeated. Paid double what he owed, which a man only does when he wants to leave fast and quiet. Joe glanced at her sidelong. Also saw the sheriff ride out last night, late. Rosa went very still. Alfred rode out last night, toward the canyon road, heading east. Joe paused. Only it wasn't quite right. She looked at him. What do you mean? I've saddled that man's horse 100 times. I know how he rides. This one. Joe worked the leather again, frowning. Set the stirrups wrong. Sheriff always has his left stirrup 1 hole shorter than his right, old injury. This man had them even. He paused again. And he sat like a man who learned to ride on flat ground. Sheriff rides like he grew up in terrain. You feel it in the way they lean into a turn. Rosa stared at the old livery keeper for a moment, feeling something between relief and dread. Relief, because she was not wrong. dread because what it meant was already forming with terrible clarity in her mind. "That was not the sheriff who rode out last night," she said. Joe looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I don't believe it was. And the real Alfred Redmond," she said, "has been somewhere else since at minimum last night." Joe nodded once. "Joe," she said, "I need your fastest horse and I need you to tell no one I have taken it." He didn't ask a single question. He just set down the harness and went to saddle her a horse. While he worked, she thought about what she knew. Alfred had been replaced by a double. The double's purpose was to establish Alfred's presence in town during a specific window of time. That specific window of time implied that something was happening somewhere else that needed to appear unconnected to Callaway Creek's sheriff. The double had visited her studio specifically, which meant that her portrait sessions with Alfred were publicly known, and someone had calculated that if the artist who knew his face best believed the double was real, the rest of the town certainly would. They had not calculated that she would see through it in the first 20 seconds. The canyon road heading east led, after about 8 miles, to the ruins of an old Spanish mission that had been abandoned since an Apache conflict in 1870. After the mission, if you kept going, you reached the border of the Harlan Crane Ranch, which was the largest cattle operation in the territory, and had been the subject of legal disputes with 3 smaller ranches and the territory government for the last 2 years. Alfred had been in the middle of those disputes. He had also, she knew from things he had said carefully during their sessions, been accumulating evidence against Crane for practices that went well beyond grazing disputes, practices that involved the kind of organized violence that was designed to look like accidents. A man like Harlan Crane, with a man like Alfred Redmond building a case against him, had every reason to want that sheriff removed from the board. And if Alfred disappeared without a trace, without even being reported as missing because a double was sitting in his office, no one would know to look for him until it was far too late. Rosa took the horse from Joe, put her foot in the stirrup and rode east. She had been riding since she was 6 years old. Her father had owned a horse she was not technically allowed to use, which had been irrelevant, and she had developed in complete secrecy what she privately considered to be a perfectly competent relationship with the animal. This was an understatement. She rode the way she painted, with quiet, focused authority and a complete disregard for the opinion of anyone who thought she shouldn't be doing it. The horse, a dark bay gelding named whatever Joe called him, was responsive and fast, and she covered the first 3 miles of Canyon Road in less time than she had expected. The land out here was the kind of brutal beauty that she had been trying to work out how to paint for years. Red and ochre canyon walls rising on either side, juniper and pinon dotting the broken terrain, the sky above a shade of blue so pure and violent it looked almost hostile. The afternoon heat pressed down on everything. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the terrain the way she had learned to scan a canvas, not looking for anything specific but looking for the thing that was wrong, the element that didn't fit the composition. She found it 2 miles before the mission. There was a narrow side canyon cutting north from the main road, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, and at its mouth, someone had recently attempted to sweep away tracks with a branch. The sweeping was careful but not careful enough. She could see the brush marks, the disturbed dust, and beneath them, faintly, the ghost of a single horse's passage heading into the side canyon. 1 horse, 1 rider. Going north, into terrain that got rougher fast, she turned her borrowed gelding into the side canyon and followed. The side canyon opened after half a mile into a small, roughly circular hollow ringed by red rock walls. There was a shallow seep of water at the far end, which was why the place existed and why someone would have known about it. Old cottonwoods grew around the water, providing shade, which was the only soft thing about any of this. Alfred Redmond was sitting with his back against one of the cottonwood trunks, his wrists bound in front of him with rope, his badge gone, his hat gone, a bruise along his left jaw that was going purple and green in a way that suggested it was between 12 and 24 hours old. He was conscious, which was the first enormously relieving thing. His eyes, when she rode into the hollow, snapped immediately to her with the particular alertness of a man who had been waiting for what he expected to be his death and was recalibrating rapidly. Rosa brought the horse to a stop 10 feet from him and swung down without ceremony. "You are extremely difficult to find," she told him, going directly to the rope at his wrists, "and whoever tied this is not a sailor." Alfred stared at her. "Rosa." Yes, she examined the knot, identified its weakness, and began working at it with steady fingers. "How long have you been here?" "Since last night." His voice was rough with thirst. "They hit me coming out of the office. 3 of them." "Rosa, how did you find me?" "Joe Halloran noticed the double set your stirrups wrong." She worked at the rope. "I noticed the double's scar was positioned incorrectly, and his left corner of his mouth lifts 2 degrees too high when he smiles. Also, his hands were too smooth." A silence. She glanced up and found Alfred watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not in 43 days of intensive study, and she had thought by now she had catalogued them all. "You spotted the difference," he said slowly. "Immediately. The moment he walked in the door, the rope gave way. She moved around to check whether he was otherwise injured. I had painted your face for 6 weeks, Alfred. I know every line of it better than your mother did. There was never going to be any chance of fooling me." He was silent for a moment, flexing his freed wrists, while she efficiently assessed the bruise on his jaw, the scrape above his left ear, and a cut on his right hand that was not serious but needed cleaning. Then he said, with a gravity that was not his usual professional steadiness but something rower and deeper, "Rosa, they were going to come back tonight. They were not planning to leave me here alive indefinitely." She met his eyes directly. "I know," she said. "You came alone, into the canyon. On the chance that you were right." "I was right," she said, without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact. He looked at her for another long moment, and she could see something moving in his face, something large and complicated that he was deciding what to do with. She went to the horse and retrieved the canteen Joe had strapped to the saddle, because Joe Halloran was an excellent judge of situations, and brought it to him. Alfred drank, long and grateful, and when he lowered the canteen he said, "I have been a lawman for 11 years. No one has ever done what you just did." "Then they were not paying close enough attention," she said, and began planning their way out of the canyon. Getting back to Callaway Creek required strategy, because the double was still there, and whoever had orchestrated this would have people watching for any sign that the plan had gone wrong. Alfred did not have his badge or his gun, both of which had been taken, but he had his mind, and so did she. And between the two of them they were considerably better resourced than their opponents appeared to expect. They rode double on Joe's gelding, Alfred behind her, which created an entirely new category of awareness that Rosa addressed by focusing very deliberately on the practical problem in front of her. The warmth of him at her back, the way his chest moved against her shoulder blades with each breath, the steadying weight of him despite everything he had just been through, these were details she was not going to paint into anything. She was absolutely going to paint them into everything. "Crane's men," Alfred said, as they picked their way back through the side canyon, speaking quietly close to her ear. "I've been building a case against Harlan Crane for 8 months. He controls 2 judges and the county assessor, which is why I haven't been able to move legally. I finally had what I needed last week." Witness testimony from one of his former hands, a man named Beaumont, who was willing to sign a deposition about the incidents at the Ortega and Delgado ranches. 2 families driven off their land by what was made to look like natural disasters but wasn't. "The Ortega and Delgado families," Rosa said. "What happened to them?" A pause that was heavy with something. "They left the territory, lost everything. 2 of the Ortega boys were badly hurt. Crane claimed a flash flood took out their irrigation. It wasn't a flood." Rosa thought about this, and Beaumont's testimony was what Crane needed to stop. "If I disappear tonight, the investigation disappears with me. The new man they'd appoint wouldn't have my 8 months of work, and Beaumont without my protection would find it very dangerous to keep talking. Where is Beaumont now? Safe house, McCready's place out west of town. I was supposed to meet him last night to finalize the deposition. Instead, Crane's men got to me first. He paused. Someone told them about the meeting. Someone in the sheriff's office. My deputy has been with me 3 years. I trust him entirely. His voice was measured, careful. But someone knew. Someone who watches the sheriff's patterns, Rosa said slowly. Someone with access to your movements, your schedule. She thought about this for a moment. The town council approved the portrait commission. They knew your schedule for the sitting sessions. They are not all Crane's people, surely, but if one of them was, and if they were watching you closely enough, they might have noticed that you had a meeting with a witness if the witness came to town, if he came to see you at the office. Beaumont did come in 1 week ago, Alfred said very quietly. Only for 20 minutes, but he came in daylight. Then someone saw him and knew what it meant. Rosa considered this. Which council member has Crane's ear? You have been in this town 6 weeks, Alfred said. I observe people for a living, she replied. A brief silence. Alderman Foss has been receiving payments I cannot trace. His bank deposits don't match his declared income. Foss, Rosa said, filing it. All right, here is what I think we need to do. She laid out the plan as they rode, concisely and with the same systematic clarity she brought to any complex problem. Alfred listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she finished he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That is a better plan than anything I had." "You were tied to a tree," she said. "You get some latitude." She felt, rather than saw, the smile against the back of her head. It felt like the smile she had been painting into the portrait, the real one, the one that only appeared when something genuinely reached him. The plan, such as it was, required 3 things. First, they needed to get Alfred back into town without the double or Crane's watchers knowing he was there. Second, they needed to remove the double from the sheriff's office without raising an alarm. Third, they needed to secure Beaumont and the deposition before anyone could reach him. Joe Halloran, it turned out, was useful on all 3 fronts. He brought them into town after dark through the freight yard behind the livery. He had his son quietly fetch Alfred's spare badge and gun from the locked chest in Alfred's house, where Alfred said to look. And he sent his oldest daughter on the pretext of a social call to the McCready place to warn Beaumont not to move until morning. The double was a problem that required finesse. Alfred wanted to go directly, badge and gun and authority, which was direct and simple and would almost certainly tip off Crane's people before they had what they needed. Rosa wanted to use the portrait. "What?" Alfred said, with genuine blankness. "The portrait," she said again. She had brought her sketchbook from her coat pocket and was already working by the light of Joe's lantern, her pencil moving with the rapid, precise assurance of someone thinking in images. The sittings are public knowledge. Anyone in town knows the artist calls in the sheriff for sessions. If I send word to the double that I need one more sitting tonight, critical lighting condition. This time of year there's a particular quality to evening light that can't be replicated. I may need him for an hour. He will come. Because he needs to maintain the fiction, and refusing would raise questions. And then you will be there, and he will not. Alfred stared at her. You want to lure him in with the portrait. With the promise of it. She showed him the sketch she had just made. It was fast and rough compared to her usual work, but it captured the double's face with unmistakable accuracy, noting the scar placement, the slightly different smile, the smooth hands. This is also evidence. When Foss and Crane's legal people try to deny involvement, this sketch, combined with Joe's testimony about the stirrups and my own testimony about the facial differences, constitutes documentation of premeditated imposture, which is a federal offense. Alfred looked at the sketch for a long moment. He looked at her. He looked back at the sketch. "Rosa," he said, with a particular quality in his voice that she had not heard from him before, and that did something inconvenient to her composure. "The note to the double," she said briskly. He kept looking at her for one more moment, and then he took the pen Joe offered and wrote the note. The double came at the appointed time, which was 9 in the evening, when Main Street was quiet but not empty, when there were enough people around that a scene would be witnessed. He came in the front door of Rosa's studio and found her at her easel as expected, and the lamp burning at the arranged angle, and everything exactly as it should be. And then Alfred came out of the shadow at the back of the room, and everything was exactly as it needed to be. The double went for the gun at his hip, which was Alfred's gun, which he had no practice with and fumbled badly, and Alfred had crossed the room and had his wrist in a grip that removed all further options before the draw was half completed. It was done in about 4 seconds. Rosa kept her eyes on the canvas because she was adding a final detail to the portrait, and the light was genuinely good tonight. "Name," Alfred said, holding the man pinned against the wall. The double, whose name turned out to be Crick, had the look of a man who had just calculated his options and found them all unfavorable. He was not in the end a dedicated criminal. He was a hired man who had taken a job he now clearly wished he had declined, and faced with the actual Alfred Redmond rather than an empty room, he assessed the situation with admirable speed. He told them everything. Harlan Crane had orchestrated it all. Crane had been watching Alfred's investigation for months and had identified Rosa's portrait sessions as the one fixed, regular point in the sheriff's schedule. Crane had found Crick through a contact in Denver, a man who made his living doing exactly this kind of work, providing bodies with the right general appearance for situations that required a temporary substitute for someone inconvenient. Crick was to maintain the appearance of Alfred's presence in Callaway Creek for 3 days, at which point Alfred's body would have been found in the canyon with injuries consistent with a horse fall, a tragic accident, and Crane's men would have reached Beaumont. The Ortega and Delgado families, whose land Crane had stolen, would have been beyond further recourse. Alderman Foss, when confronted that same night by Alfred, his deputy Harris, and a territorial marshal who had been summoned by wire through a connection Alfred had carefully maintained for precisely this kind of situation, demonstrated the particular kind of collapse that men who have been comfortable in corruption for a long time demonstrate when the structure that supported them suddenly isn't there. He signed a statement within the hour. Harlan Crane was arrested at his ranch house at midnight. The marshals went in with enough numbers that the situation, which might otherwise have been violent, was instead merely humiliating for a man who had believed himself untouchable. He did not look, Rosa thought, when she heard the account the next morning, like a man who had ever expected to be found out. That was the particular blindness of powerful men who surrounded themselves only with people who agreed with them. It made them incapable of accounting for the variables they hadn't anticipated. They had not anticipated Rosa Beckett. The week that followed was the kind of exhausting, procedural, paperwork-heavy business that the actual practice of frontier law involved, and that the stories about it rarely mentioned. Alfred was in meetings with territorial authorities, writing reports, corresponding with the Federal Circuit Court in Santa Fe, and managing the complex process of beginning to restore what had been taken from the Ortega and Delgado families, which was not going to be a simple or fast process, but which he had committed to pursuing with the same methodical determination he brought to everything. Rosa finished the portrait. She worked on it with the particular focus of an artist who knows she is completing something significant. She had all the technical problems solved by now, the light, the color relationships, the compositional balance. What she was working on in these final days was something more subtle, the quality of the subject's inner life as expressed through the accumulated specificity of his face. She had to be very careful with this part, had to stay technically rigorous, and not let her own feelings bleed into the image in a way that belonged to her rather than to him. The finished portrait showed Alfred Redmond at 3/4 to the window, in his sheriff's coat, with his badge catching the light at a precise angle. His expression was not the neutral professional dignity that most commissioned subjects preferred. Rosa had not been able to make herself paint that, because it would have been a lie and she did not paint lies. Instead, it showed a man of absolute steadiness and contained, careful intelligence, and the particular quality of loneliness that came from choosing duty over intimacy for too long. And very subtly, the first suggestion of something changing, something opening very slightly in the eyes, as though the subject had just encountered something that surprised him. She had painted the moment he first shook her hand. She had not planned to. It was simply what her hand knew to paint. She was covering the finished work with a cloth when Alfred came to the studio. He knocked, which he always did now, though in the early weeks he had sometimes just appeared in the doorway. She noticed the change and noted it. "Marshal Jenkins has what he needs from Santa Fe," he said, coming in and settling in the chair he had occupied for 43 days, then seeming to realize that the chair was now unoccupied and available with a different significance than before and looking momentarily uncertain. "The federal indictment is being drawn up. Crane's property is frozen pending the investigation. The land claim process for the Ortega and Delgado families is going to take time, but Jenkins thinks there's a strong case for restitution." "Good," Rosa said. She put down her brush and looked at him. "And Beaumont, he is safe. Beaumont is staying in Callaway Creek, at least for the time being. I've offered him work, legitimate work. He's a good man who made some bad choices when he was poor and desperate. He deserves the chance." Alfred looked at his hands, then back at her. "The town council is holding a formal ceremony next week. For the portrait, they'd like you to be there." "I'll be there," she said. A silence, not an uncomfortable one. Their silences had always been a particular quality, dense with observation, different from ordinary silence. "Rosa," he said, "I have been trying to work out how to say something to you for several days." She waited. He looked at her with that direct, measuring steadiness that she had spent weeks painting, that she could now read as clearly as print. "What you did in finding me and getting me out of that canyon and managing the whole situation with the double, that was not something that most people would have done. It was not something that most people could have done. The skill it took, the observation, the nerve." He stopped. "I have never met anyone like you." "That is frequently true," she said, though her voice was slightly less steady than usual. "I am not common." "No," he agreed very quietly. "You are not." She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the room, picked up the cloth, and lifted it from the portrait. Alfred stood and looked at it for a long time. She watched him look at it, which was a different kind of looking than looking at a person, because when you looked at a portrait you saw what someone else had found in you, and that was a particular kind of exposure. "That is me," he said finally. "Yes. That is what you see when you look at me. Yes." He turned from the portrait to her, and the quality of his expression was the one that was not in the portrait because she had not been able to paint this one that was newer and was specifically about her. And she felt it the way you feel the full sun after a long winter, with a shock of warmth that was almost overwhelming. "I don't want you to leave Callaway Creek," he said. It was not the most romantic sentence she had ever heard. It was plain and direct, and it carried the exact weight of a man who chose his words carefully and had spent several days choosing these particular ones. "I was not planning to leave immediately," she said, with equal care. "The council ceremony is next week." After the council ceremony, she looked at him. He was still looking at her with that same expression. She had the portrait, she could put it next to him right now and compare, and the portrait would be extraordinary and technically accomplished and deeply felt, and the man was something the portrait could never fully capture because he was real and present and looking at her like that. "I would need to have work," she said. "I cannot stay somewhere without work. I am not a woman who can simply exist in a place. I require occupation. There are 12 ranching families within 20 miles of Callaway Creek," he said, "most of whom have been waiting for a portrait artist to come through for years. There are 3 more towns on the stage line, and the courthouse portrait is going to generate considerable interest." He had clearly thought about this. She felt something warm and complicated moving in her chest. "I would need my own studio space," she said. "Proper north light. The room above the mercantile is acceptable but not ideal. The building next to the land office has the right orientation," he said immediately. "The owner has been trying to rent it for a year." She stared at him. "You scouted studio locations." "I made some inquiries," he said, with a studied neutrality that was completely undone by the fact that she could see exactly what his face was doing. She crossed the room and stood close enough that she had to look up to see his face, because he was considerably taller than she was, and at this distance the difference in their heights became relevant. She put her right hand flat against his chest, not gently, but with the direct confidence that she brought to everything. "Alfred Redmond," she said, "I am going to kiss you now. I wanted to inform you first because I believe in honesty." His hands came up to her face with a gentleness that was entirely inconsistent with everything about the size and the strength and the 11 years of frontier lawmanship. He tilted her face up. "I appreciate the warning," he said, and closed the distance. She had painted 1,000 faces and understood every line and light and shadow of what it meant to be human, but she had not previously had data on what it felt like to be kissed by Alfred Redmond. And the data was excellent and thoroughly overwhelmed her analytical capacity for a significant and uncharacteristic period of time. When they finally separated, she kept her hand where it was on his chest and felt his heart beating, which was fast, which was gratifying. "I am going to need," she said carefully, "to add to the portrait." "You said it was finished," he said, looking down at her with that new expression that she was going to have to work out how to paint. "I have new information," she said. He laughed. She had heard him laugh before a few times in 43 days, a rare and genuine sound, but not like this. This was open and warm and came from somewhere unguarded, and it was, she thought, the finest sound she had heard in years. She was very definitely not leaving Callaway Creek. The ceremony for the portrait was held on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the Crane arrest, on a morning when the sky was the particular deep-water blue that appeared in New Mexico in late summer when the monsoon season was thinking about ending. The new courthouse, which smelled of fresh timber and paint and the specific optimism of things that were just built, had a receiving room large enough to hold the portrait with proper viewing space, and the better part of Callaway Creek's population had turned up, because in a town of 300 people, a formal ceremony represented an unusual occasion. Rosa stood at the back of the room and watched the painting be unveiled, which she always did, standing slightly apart, the artist observing the effect of her work on others. She catalogued reactions the way she always did, who was moved, who was surprised, who leaned in to look closer. Several of the ranching wives she had been introduced to over the past 2 weeks came to speak to her about potential commissions. She accepted 3 with her customary calm and filed the details neatly. Alfred caught her eye across the room and held it for a moment, which was the kind of private moment that required no words and that she was coming to understand was one of the ways he spoke. Beaumont, who had stayed on as Alfred had offered, was in the back of the room with the look of a man who was still deciding whether he was allowed to be somewhere safe. Rosa had started a charcoal sketch of his face the previous week, in an unguarded moment when he was talking to Alfred's deputy Harris over coffee. She was going to work it up into a proper portrait. She did not know yet exactly why, but her instincts were rarely wrong about these things. The Ortega and Delgado land cases were moving through the territorial court. It was slow. Alfred had warned her it would be slow. He was in correspondence with a lawyer in Santa Fe who had taken the cases on contingency, a man with a reputation for being willing to challenge powerful interests. And Alfred had also written a formal letter to the federal district court, requesting that the cases be escalated given the documented pattern of deliberate criminal activity. Rosa had helped him draft that letter, sitting at the desk in his office one evening while he spoke, and she wrote, because his handwriting was functional rather than legible, and hers was the kind of precise, clear script that commanded immediate respect on a page. They had been in his office until quite late that evening, and afterward he had walked her back to the studio through streets that were quiet and warm, and at the door he had kissed her again, less carefully this time but no less gently. and she had decided that the north-facing room next to the land office was going to be an excellent decision. She moved into it in September, which was a considerable logistical undertaking involving her 17 pieces of luggage, 3 new canvases she had acquired in anticipation of the ranching family commissions, and a particular argument with the building's owner about the installation of an additional window that she eventually won by the simple expedient of explaining exactly why the light from the original window was insufficient for the technical demands of oil portraiture in a way that was so specific and so knowledgeable that the man, who had initially said no, simply stared at her and then agreed. Alfred helped her move in, which was the kind of help that involved him carrying the heaviest cases without being asked and managing to do so with complete naturalness, as though it had not occurred to him that there was any question of whether he would. He was, she had discovered, a man whose competence and protectiveness expressed themselves through action rather than declaration, which suited her entirely because she had a deep allergy to declarations that were not backed by corresponding action. She was painting more, she was sleeping better. She was waking up in the mornings in the room above the new studio and looking at the ceiling and feeling something in her chest that she needed several weeks to correctly identify because she had never felt it quite this specifically before. She was happy, not contentedly happy, the quiet kind that she had always known through the satisfaction of her work, actively happy. The kind that had weight and texture and made ordinary things, morning coffee, the particular sound of the street waking up, the feeling of a good brush in her hand, vivid in a way that was new. She told Alfred this in October, sitting on the porch of his house in the cool evening air that meant autumn was arriving, while he had one arm around her shoulders and was looking at the stars with the quiet attention of a man at rest, a state she had rarely seen in him in the early weeks and that she was glad to see more of now. "I am happy," she said, with the directness that was simply her native language. He looked down at her with an expression she could read perfectly now. She had added considerably to her catalog in the past months. "So am I," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. She was not generally a woman who leaned on things. She was reconsidering this. The winter was the frontier kind, cold and sharp and honest about it, with snow in November that turned the canyon country into a study in black and white that Rosa immediately needed to paint and did, going out in the cold with her pached box strapped to her back, and coming home pink-cheeked and exhilarated with 4 small panel paintings that she was extremely pleased with. She had commissioned work through the winter months, the 3 ranching family portraits she had accepted in September, 2 more from families in the next town on the stage line, and a particularly interesting request from the garrison at the river fort, who wanted a formal group portrait of their officer corps. She negotiated that commission with the same brisk efficiency she brought to all her business, getting twice what they first offered and a better schedule, and then she delivered work so good that they immediately requested a second portrait for the regional headquarters. Alfred watched all of this with a specific pride that she could read clearly, the pride of someone observing competence they deeply respect in another person, the kind that has nothing of condescension in it, because there is no assumption that the capability was unexpected. He had known from practically the first conversation what she was. He did not find it surprising that she was excellent at what she did. He simply found it genuinely admirable, the way you admire something that operates beautifully by design. He told her this on a December evening when she came home from delivering the garrison commission and found him at her kitchen table with coffee ready and the lamp lit, because he had known what time she would return. He told her in the careful, measured way he said things that mattered, without preamble but with complete sincerity. She listened with the same completeness she brought to everything, and when he finished she crossed the room and sat across from him and looked at him for a moment. "I love you," she said. He looked at her. His face, which she knew better than any face she had ever studied, went through a very fast sequence of expressions that settled into something warm and certain and specific. "I love you," he said, with the same simplicity that she had. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held it. They stayed like that for a long time, in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning and the snow falling outside the window, and Rosa thought that this was a painting she did not need to make because she was living inside it. He proposed in February. She had half expected him to do it with some ceremony, some planned moment of frontier romance, a ride into the canyon at sunset or a formal arrangement at the hotel restaurant. Instead, he did it in her studio at 9 in the morning while she was prepping a canvas, and he had stopped by with a letter he needed her to look at, which was now their established shorthand for "I am looking for a reason to see you." And he set the letter on the work table and looked at her for a moment and said, "Marry me." She looked up from the canvas. He was standing in the morning light from the north window with his badge catching it and his hat in his hand, and his face wearing an expression of absolute sincerity and a very careful, very controlled nervousness that she found completely devastating in the best possible way. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. She put down her rabbit-skin glue brush. "I was not going to say no," she said, crossing the room to him. "You should know that. I was not even close to saying no." "I was not 100% certain of that," he admitted. "You should have been," she said. "I am an observer of human behavior, Alfred. If I had not been certain about you, I would have told you so quite some time ago. I believe in efficiency." He laughed. The open, warm laugh that she had decided some time ago was one of her favorite sounds in the world, and he pulled her close and held her with the careful, encompassing strength of a man who had learned that the most valuable things required the most deliberate care. They were married in March, in the Callaway Creek Church, on a day when spring was arriving in the high desert, cautious and clean and smelling of sage and cold water. The ceremony was small by the standards of the town's ambitions, because neither of them had much interest in elaborate spectacle. But the church was full because Alfred had been the law of this county for 11 years, and people came to honor that. And because Rosa had spent 8 months painting the faces of this community, and the community had come to see their own reflection in what she made and felt because of it, that she belonged to them in some way. Joe Halloran was there, which Rosa had specifically requested. His daughter, whose portrait Rosa had given as a gift, stood with her father and looked at the painting on the church wall, a small landscape Rosa had donated in lieu of flowers, and cried a little, which Joe pretended not to notice while clearly noticing. Deputy Harris was best man, because he had been with Alfred for 3 years and had, in the weeks since the Crane affair, demonstrated a specific and total loyalty that Alfred valued as the rarest of things. Beaumont was there too, in the back, still with the look of a man who was not certain he was allowed to be comfortable in decent company, but who was trying. Rosa had quietly spoken with Harris about including Beaumont in the sheriff's office work more regularly, and Harris, who was perceptive, had understood what she was doing and agreed that it was the right thing. She wore blue, not the pale, decorative blue that was fashionable, but a deep, strong blue that suited the territory and the light and the person she was. Her hair was pinned up in the way she wore it when she was working, practical and precise, because she was always, in some fundamental sense, working, observing and recording and finding the truth of things, and she did not believe that a wedding day required her to be someone she was not. Alfred looked at her when she came down the aisle and did the thing with his face that she loved best about him, the thing where every careful control he maintained dropped completely for just a moment, and what was underneath was visible to anyone who knew how to look, and only she did, and what was there was everything she needed to know. Harlan Crane's trial concluded in April. The territorial court found him guilty on 4 counts of criminal conspiracy, 3 counts of fraudulent land claim, and 2 counts of assault resulting in grievous harm for the injuries sustained by the Ortega boys. He was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison at Santa Fe. Crick, the double who had ultimately cooperated fully and whose testimony had been critical to the prosecution's case, received a suspended sentence and left the territory with what appeared to be genuine relief. Alderman Foss resigned from the council and left Callaway Creek quietly. The council replaced him with a cattleman's widow named Elsa Morrison, who, as it turned out, was an extraordinarily competent administrator, and who also, 6 months later, commissioned a portrait from Rosa that was one of the finest things Rosa had done in years, because Elsa Morrison had the kind of face that had been shaped by genuine courage, and courage was the thing Rosa had always known how to find and render. The Ortega and Delgado families received restitution in May, through a territorial court order that returned the market value of their land plus damages. It was not the same as having the land back, because the land itself had been absorbed into the Crane property and was now being managed by a territorial receiver, and the families had built new lives elsewhere. But it was acknowledgement and it was compensation, and it was better than the nothing that Crane's plan would have left them with, and Alfred had fought for it for months with patient, methodical persistence. The older Ortega son, Marco, wrote Alfred a letter after the judgment. Alfred read it twice and then folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer where he kept things that mattered. He did not say anything about it. Rosa saw his face when he put it away, and she knew exactly what was in it, and she understood why he did not speak about it, because some things were too important for words to carry without diminishing them. In June, Rosa discovered she was pregnant. She told Alfred on a Sunday morning when they were both at the kitchen table with coffee, because there was no version of her personality that could construct elaborate announcements for information this significant, and because she had long since established with him that directness was the language of everything real between them. He looked at her for a moment. She watched his face. What moved across it was not simple, not just happiness, though happiness was there clearly and openly. It was something larger and more complex. Wonder was part of it, and a particular quality of feeling suddenly accountable for the continuation of something larger than the daily work. And beneath all of it, steady and sure, love, the kind that had settled into the structure of him now and was not going anywhere. "Well," he said, with a careful restraint that was completely undone by his eyes. "Well," she agreed. He reached across the table. She took his hand. Their son was born in January of 1884, in the bedroom of the house Alfred owned that had now also become Rosa's house, in the particular deep cold of a high desert winter that made the stars outside the window enormous and very close. He was small and thoroughly furious about the whole situation, which Rosa found completely appropriate. Alfred held him with the careful, encompassing strength that he brought to all things that required gentleness, and the expression on his face was the one she had not yet found a way to paint, the one that was entirely beyond her technical capacity, though she was working on it. They named him James, after Alfred's father, who had died when Alfred was 12, and who Alfred remembered as a man of quiet integrity in a territory that made integrity expensive. It was a good name. James Redmond, who arrived in the world with a full voice and strong lungs and clear gray eyes that were eventually going to match his father's exactly, was a thoroughly satisfying child, not simple. He had his mother's temperament and his father's stubbornness, and was therefore magnificent, but satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when they are exactly right. Rosa went back to painting when James was 10 weeks old, which surprised the town, which thought new mothers rested, and surprised no one who knew Rosa. She worked with James in a basket beside the easel, which created some minor compositional challenges that she worked around with the same problem-solving focus she brought to everything, and which produced, as a side effect, the most interesting series of small, informal portraits of a sleeping infant that Callaway Creek had ever seen. She was also, in the evenings, working on something larger. A second portrait of Alfred, not a commissioned one, not civic or official in any way, but a private one for the house. She worked on it slowly, over many months, because she had more information now and was being very careful about how to use it. This portrait showed him in the kitchen doorway on a Sunday morning, the way she had actually seen him standing one morning when James was 3 months old, and Alfred had been up with the baby at some hours that should not exist, and had come to stand in the kitchen doorway holding James against his chest, both of them apparently having arrived at a mutual understanding. The baby finally quiet and Alfred looking out through the window above the sink at the early light on the canyon walls, with an expression of absolute peace. She had not told him she was going to paint it. She was not going to tell him until it was done. The portrait of the baby in the kitchen doorway was finished by the time James was 14 months old, walking with the determined, precarious momentum of a person who has decided that falling is simply a data point. And Rosa unveiled it on a Sunday morning while Alfred was drinking his coffee and James was experimentally disassembling a wooden spoon. Alfred looked at it for a long time. "That was from memory," Rosa said, "from a morning in October." He turned and looked at her. She met his eyes directly as she always did. "You were watching me," he said. "I am always watching you," she said. "You knew that when you married me." He looked back at the portrait. "I remember that morning. James had been awake since 3. I didn't wake you." "You never wake me," she said. "I wake anyway. I watched from the doorway." She paused. "You looked happy." "I was happy," he said. He crossed the room, and she put down her coffee cup to make room for him, and he held her the way he had held her on the day she got back from the canyon in the cold darkness, with the terrible relief of the living and the saved between them. The same quality of care, only warmer now, fuller, because they had more history to carry it. The summer of 1884 brought a new challenge to Callaway Creek in the form of a railroad survey that threatened to displace several of the small community settlements along the proposed route. And Alfred spent 3 months in correspondence with the territorial government and the railroad company's representatives, because that was what frontier justice required. Not always guns and confrontation, but frequently the slower and more difficult work of argument and documentation, and the insistence that people who had built lives in a place had a right to stay in it. Rosa contributed by doing something she had not done before. She created a series of portrait sketches of the affected families, fast and precise and undeniably powerful, which Alfred submitted with his formal letters to the territorial government. She did this without being asked. He came home one evening and found her with the sketches spread across the work table, 23 faces looking up from the paper, and he stood in the doorway looking at them for a moment, and then at her. "These are for the land case," he said. "People respond to faces," she said. "They can abstract away from numbers and names. They cannot look a person in the face and continue to pretend he does not exist. These are evidence that these are people." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sketches. "I have to send these with my next letter," he said. "That is what I made them for," she said. The railroad survey was eventually rerouted, citing, among other documentation, the evidence of established community presence along the original route. It was not only the sketches. There were legal arguments and political pressures and the intervention of several sympathetic voices in the territorial legislature. But Rosa's portraits were included in the final case file, and the railroad company's own review board later noted, in internal correspondence that she never saw and Alfred learned about only much later, that the documentation of affected residents had been unusually compelling. James Redmond turned 2, and then 3, and then 4, becoming in the process a person of very strong opinions about horses, which he was allowed to visit at Joe Halloran's livery, with the same regularity that Rosa had visited the livery the day she went looking for his father. Joe, who was getting older and moving more slowly, thought this was the best possible thing and began teaching the boy things with the patient, quiet authority that Rosa remembered from that first conversation over the harness leather. In 1886, Rosa discovered she was pregnant again. She told Alfred the same way she had told him the first time at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. He laughed, the open, warm laugh. "Well," he said again. "Well," she agreed. Their second child was a daughter, born in March of 1887, with Rosa's dark hair and Alfred's gray eyes, and an immediate, comprehensive authority over every person in the house that she exercised from her very first hours of existence with complete serenity. They named her Margaret, which was Alfred's mother's name, and called her Maggie, which she would eventually decide was fine for now and formally correct to the longer version when she was 7, which everyone would accept without question because she would deliver this preference in a tone that made it quite clear the matter was settled. The portrait of Alfred and James in the kitchen doorway hung in the main room of the house. Rosa had started a second large private work, which she kept covered and would not let anyone see until it was finished. It took her nearly a year to complete, working on it in the evening after the children were in bed and sometimes in the early morning before the household woke up. When she unveiled it, the children were 3 and 1, and Alfred stood in front of it for a long time in the particular silence he used for things that mattered. It was all 4 of them, painted in the golden light that fell through the kitchen window on Sunday mornings, with James on the floor with a wooden horse that Joe had carved for him, and Maggie in Rosa's arms doing the thing she did, where she looked at the world with the specific, evaluating attention she had inherited entirely from her mother, and Alfred with his arm around Rosa's shoulders looking at the 2 children, with the expression that Rosa had been trying for months to find the exact right color for, and had finally succeeded. She had painted them into an ordinary Sunday morning. She had painted the whole truth of it, the love that had nothing dramatic about it anymore because it had settled into the structure of daily life and was therefore present in everything, in coffee and light and the weight of an arm around a shoulder and the sound of a child's voice and the particular quality of the morning before the day begins, when everything is exactly as it should be. "This is us," Alfred said, the way he had said years ago. "That is me," standing in front of the first portrait. "Yes," she said. He looked at it for another long moment. "You painted us happy." "I painted us truthfully," she said. "You are the one who made us happy." He turned from the painting, and she watched his face do the sequence she knew completely now, every single frame of it, the control dropping and what was underneath arriving. And it was the same thing it had always been, full and certain and specifically about her. And it was not less for the years, it was more, because love was one of those things she had discovered that grew with tending. He crossed the room and held her face in his hands the way he had the first time he kissed her in the studio, with the same careful, encompassing gentleness, and she put her hands over his and held them there. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I painted it." He laughed. She laughed. In the other room, James called for someone, and Maggie, improbably, responded with a sound that was meant to be language and wasn't yet, but very nearly was. And the morning light came through the window at the angle that Rosa had spent years understanding, warm and direct and completely honest. She kissed him, and in the kitchen the children were talking to each other in whatever language children use before they have all the words, and the canyon country outside the window was the same brutal, beautiful red it had always been, and Callaway Creek was alive with the specific life of a frontier town that was becoming something, slowly, imperfectly, with the work of people who believed that the place you build a law around becomes the kind of place that deserves to exist. Rosa Beckett Redmond was, at 33, the most respected portrait artist in the New Mexico territory. She had a studio with a proper north window. She had 2 children who were going to be extraordinary. She had a husband who had never once, in all the time she had known him, looked at her capability with anything less than complete respect and genuine admiration, who had never tried to diminish the parts of her that were inconvenient or difficult or more competent than expected, who had, in fact, loved her precisely because of those things, because he was the kind of man who recognized strength and found it irresistible. She had, that first afternoon when a man walked through her studio door wearing Alfred's face and not being Alfred, made a choice that saved a life and set in motion everything that followed. And she had made it with the same directness and certainty she brought to everything, the way she had spent her whole life making choices, looking at what was true and acting on it, refusing to pretend she saw less than she did. The portrait on the courthouse wall still hung there. Callaway Creek's population had grown. There were new families and new buildings and 2 more school teachers and a doctor who had finally agreed to stay. And every new person who came to the courthouse eventually stopped in front of Alfred Redmond's portrait and looked at it with the particular arrested attention that genuine portraiture creates, the feeling of meeting someone through the evidence of how they were truly seen. And if they asked, someone would usually tell them that the artist who painted it had saved the sheriff's life, that she had spotted a double in the first moment, where no one else had seen anything wrong, that she had ridden into the canyon alone and found him and brought him home, that she was still here, still painting, still the sharpest pair of eyes in the territory, and that the sheriff, who had spent 11 years choosing duty over everything else, had found, in a portrait session that was supposed to be professional and civic and temporary, the one person whose mind matched his own in the ways that mattered, and had known what that meant, and had not let it go. Rosa was in her studio on the morning the story usually ends, but her story did not end. She was standing at her easel, working on a commission for a ranching family south of town, a grandmother whose face had the kind of geography that took a lifetime to build, and that Rosa found endlessly interesting. James was in school. Maggie was with Alfred, who took her on Saturday mornings when the office was quiet and let her sit in the big chair behind the desk and look very official, which she did, with complete commitment. Rosa worked in the quiet studio with the north light falling exactly where she wanted it, and she thought, as she often did while painting, about all the faces she had known and found and made permanent. She thought about Alfred's face on the first day, contained and professional and carrying its careful loneliness. She thought about his face in the kitchen doorway with James asleep against his chest. She thought about his face this morning at the table, ordinary and close and entirely known to her. She dipped her brush and went back to work. Outside, the canyon country was the everlasting red and ochre and blue that she would spend the rest of her life finding new ways to render and never fully capturing, because some things were bigger than any image you could make of them, and that was the point of trying. She was happy. She was working. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, which she had known the moment she rode east into the canyon on a borrowed horse with her heart beating fast, and her mind absolutely clear, following the evidence of what she had seen, trusting the accuracy of her own perception, and finding, at the end of a narrow side canyon in the brutal summer heat of New Mexico in 1882, the man whose face she already knew better than her own.